This is Grande Prairie, Alberta, a bustling city of nearly 30,000 people. Grande Prairie is one of the largest cities in Alberta's north and boasts a hospital, stores, restaurants, theaters, an art gallery, and a museum. In fact, just about everything people want in a city. Together, we're going to take a journey back in time to learn more about the early days of Grande Prairie and how the Edson Trail and the people who traveled over it helped to build this community. Many years ago, when Alberta was a new province, people began to hear stories about the Peace River country. The few who ventured up here brought back tales about what a big place it was and how rich the farmland was. They learned how inexpensive it was to build a farm because at that time you could purchase a 160-acre homestead for about $10. The people who wanted to move to Grande Prairie were looking for a new life. They often lived in places that were very busy and crowded, and they longed for fresh air and wide open spaces. Other people lived in areas where all the farmland was taken. There were no farms left to buy, and they worried about what their children would do to make a living. They decided to move to Grande Prairie, where land was plentiful and there was enough for everyone. In the early 1900s, there was only one wagon trail into Grande Prairie. It was called the Long Trail by people who used it because it was 500 miles long and it took months to travel over. The Long Trail route began in Edmonton and stretched north to the Peace River crossing and Dunvegan, and then down into Grande Prairie. Pioneers who wanted to move to Grande Prairie needed a shorter route to travel. They asked the Alberta government to construct a trail from Edson to Grande Prairie, a distance of only 250 miles. That was the beginning of the Edson Trail. The government sent a road engineer named A.H. Macquarie to build the trail from Edson to Grande Prairie. Macquarie and his men had a big job ahead of them. The trail had to be cut out of dense brush. Muddy sections had to be covered with log roads called corduroy. They had to build bridges and ferries. Some people were so anxious to move to Grande Prairie, they began traveling on the trail before it was completed. Macquarie hired some of those early travelers to help him finish the job. One of the early pioneers who helped build the road was Harvey Switzer, who later went on to own Edson's first drugstore. In his memoirs, Mr. Switzer talked about what it was like to watch all those pioneer families traveling the trail on their way to Grande Prairie.
We had a ringside seat on the great tide of land seekers flowing into the country. There were people from every walk of life. One man might have nothing but his pack, another a single wagon drawn by horses or oxen. Another outfit would consist of several wagons loaded with farm machinery and supplies of all kinds.
The trail was finished in about 6 months, and people started arriving in Edson by the hundreds to begin their journey north to Grande Prairie. In 1911, Edson, Alberta was a little town of 500 people. It was one of the last stops on the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway from Edmonton. Before the Edson Trail was even created, the town of Edson began sending out flyers and posters advertising itself as the gateway to the north. Those posters convinced many people to come to Edson and begin the trip to Grande Prairie. From 1911, when the Edson Trail began operation, until the next year, the population of the town of Edson almost tripled in size to over 1,200 people. The first settlers took the train from Edmonton to Edson. When people stepped off the train in Edson, the little town didn't look like much. It was carved out of the woods, and when it rained or when the snow melted, the streets were filled with mud. But Edson was a busy place. In 1911, there were 25 different kinds of businesses in the town, including a newspaper, several lumber companies, 3 hotels, a bank, restaurants, and a horse livery stable. Pioneers planning to move to Grande Prairie found they could buy most of the supplies they needed for their trip in Edson, including a team of oxen for about $500. While in Edson, pioneer families tried to buy enough food and supplies to feed their families for a year. They knew it would take that long to build their cabins, clear their land, and harvest their first crop. They would need to purchase hundreds of pounds of food, including flour, sugar, baking powder, tea, coffee, salt, dried meat, and dried fruit. They bought some fresh vegetables like potatoes, carrots, and turnips because they kept well in cool weather, but the pioneers knew they couldn't bring things like milk and eggs because they would go bad quickly. Most Edson Trail pioneers traveled in a covered wagon called a caboose. The caboose was usually 6 feet wide and about 13 feet long. It had a wooden floor and wooden sides reaching about halfway up. The rest of the walls and the roof were made of canvas, so the caboose wouldn't be too heavy for the horses to pull. The caboose contained beds for the family to sleep on and a wood-burning stove they could cook on. Most of their food and their dishes, pots and pans, would be in the caboose. The front of the caboose would have a slit cut in the wall for the oxen reins to reach through. Someone would drive the caboose by sitting inside and watching out through the canvas. In the winter, the caboose was built on sleighs to travel over the snow. In summer, it was on wheels. The wooden walls of the caboose would sometimes be lined with newspaper pages to keep it warm inside. Once they were outfitted and they had all the food and supplies they needed, the pioneer families would begin their long trek north over the Edson Trail. Writer J.G. McGregor described the start of the journey over the Edson Trail like this.
The settlers started out bravely, going north up the main street of Edson. The main street was itself cut out of the forest. It consisted of a few stores and many hotels, for this was the busiest jumping-off place in the west. In 200 yards, those bound for Grande Prairie were out of the town, hedged in by the dark, dripping forest which was to be with them for the remainder of the trip.
People who traveled the trail in summer all had different experiences. If it hadn't been raining in a while, the trail might be dry and the trip could be quite pleasant. If it had been raining, the trail would be muddy, especially from the weight of all the other wagons tearing up the path. The summer also brought swarms of black flies and mosquitoes which would harass and upset both the men and the animals. One person who traveled over the Edson Trail in the summer was a young girl named Eunice Cook. She made the trip in the summer of 1912 with her parents and her sister.
It seems to me most of the Edson Trail was mud. Mother and Dad walked a lot to spare the ponies. In many places, the team had to be unhitched and winched out. Dad would tuck a little girl under each arm and put Ramona and me on a dry stump or log to wait until we could get started again.
Pioneers who traveled over the Edson Trail in the winter usually had better luck than summer travelers. In some years, temperatures dropped very low, but the frozen trail and the packed ice over the rivers made the journey a little easier. People had to fight the cold all the time, but they had lots of work to do to keep warm. Even the children helped drive the team or pull the wagons out of mud. All night, the family stayed warm, snuggled up in wool blankets in the caboose. Eunice Cook remembered another journey she and her sister took over the Edson Trail with their parents. This time, they traveled in the winter.
Although temperatures would drop to 60 degrees below zero, I think it was impossible for us children to get cold. We had so many clothes on. We each wore fleece-lined, long-sleeved, long-legged underwear, fleece-lined bloomers, a flannelette slip, warm dress, 2 wool sweaters, a warm coat, long wool stockings, high felt boots with overshoes, a toque with a large wool scarf tied over it, and wool mittens under leather mittens.
As the Edson Trail became popular, people began building stopping places along the trail where travelers could stay a few days, cook their meals, sleep in a bed, and leave their animals in a barn. The usual charge for staying in a stopping place was $1 to put the animals in a barn and 50 cents if the travelers wanted meals. There were usually stopping places located every 15 to 20 miles along the Edson Trail. William Innes, Grande Prairie's first bank manager, remembers one stopping place he stayed in near West Sturgeon Lake.
When we arrived, there was only one building which was newly constructed as a stable. About 15 feet of this was partitioned off for human use. There was no furniture of any kind or stove. In a corner was a fireplace made of willow and clay, which served both as heating and cooking. On the ground, for there was no floor, hay was strewn around to sleep on.
The Edson Trail was 250 miles long, and it covered some of the roughest terrain in Alberta. The brush around it was very thick, and there were many hills to climb. Parts of the trail were covered with a dark, sticky mud called muskeg. In some places, the muskeg was so deep, the animals would sink into it up to their bellies. When the animals became stuck in the mud, they had to be unhitched from the wagon, and the wagon would be pulled out by men using a rope, block, and tackle. Once it was unhitched from the wagon, the animal could usually climb out of the mud by itself, but sometimes people would have to use ropes to pull the oxen out as well. One of the scariest and most dangerous parts of the trail was Breakneck Hill, which was located just 40 miles northwest of Edson. The grade was so steep that occasionally the wagon and the oxen would slide down the hill and the load would upset. The Athabasca River was one of the biggest rivers the pioneers had to cross. In the winter, if it was very cold, they could cross the river on the ice. But in the spring, when the ice was melting, it could be very dangerous to cross the river. Sometimes people would start driving out on the ice and it would begin to break up underneath the wagon. Most people could get off before it broke, but a few couldn't, and several horses drowned in the river. In the summer, a ferry would operate on big rivers like the Athabasca. The ferries had long ropes that reached from one shore of the river across to the other. The pioneers loaded their animals and their wagons on rafts and were towed across the river. In all, pioneers who traveled the Edson Trail had to cross 6 creeks or rivers. There were other ways of traveling over the Edson Trail besides in a caboose and wagon. Some people walked over it. Some went with pack horses. One man drove a car over it, while some rode on the stagecoach. The stage route was called the Peace River Transportation Company, and the fare to ride the stage was $30 one way. The main purpose of the stage was to deliver mail to people living along the trail and into Grande Prairie, but it could also carry about 10 passengers. The stagecoach was pulled by horses, so they always had to have fresh animals stabled in barns along the Edson Trail. People who traveled on the stage were allowed to carry only 30 pounds of luggage. They were expected to help push the stage out of the mud and drag it up hills when the horses needed help. Most people found riding on the stage was so rough and bumpy, it was better to walk beside it. One of the first men to ride on the stage to Grande Prairie was William Innes, Grande Prairie's first bank manager. To his fellow stage travelers, Mr. Innes appeared to be just another homesteader. They didn't know he had $20,000 and a gun hidden in his baggage. He was taking the money to start up the bank in Grande Prairie. Life on the Edson Trail could be hard, especially if the road was bad or the animals were tired and hungry. The pioneers started traveling at sunup and would finish their journey at sundown. If they were having an easy trip, they could travel from Edson to Grande Prairie in 2 weeks. If they ran into a lot of problems, they could spend as much as 6 months on the trail. The first thing in the morning, the travelers would get up and make breakfast. If the family was living in a caboose, they would cook breakfast on the stove. If they were camping outside, they would gather wood and build a campfire. Breakfast was usually bacon, pancakes, and bread or biscuits. The mother of the family would usually start the bread in the morning and allow it to rise in the caboose during the day. In the winter, food was frozen and would take a long time to cook. Snow had to be melted for drinking water and for washing. Mrs. Gladys Moon traveled over the trail with her family. She remembered what life was like on that journey.
For us women, it was quite an experience sleeping in the caboose. We washed faces and hands in the snow, peeled frozen potatoes covered with ice, and we held the pots on the stove as the caboose jolted and swayed while we cooked meals.
The animals were important members of the family and had to be treated well. The family tried to be sure they weren't overworked and that they had time to rest regularly. Because of the dense brush around the Edson Trail, there were very few places for animals to graze for food. When the pioneers finally found an area with a lot of grassland, they would stop there for several days to allow the animals to eat their fill. The first settlers to reach Grande Prairie probably didn't find it very impressive. William Innes, the bank manager, remembered what Grande Prairie looked like the day he arrived.
I arrived in Grande Prairie at 6 o'clock. It was dark, and I almost rode past it as I expected to find a town. There was not more buildings than one would expect to find on a homestead.
Other people were pleased with their new home. Early pioneer George Perry Peebles remembered the first time he saw Grande Prairie.
In the afternoon of March 19th, 1912, we sighted Prairie City, as it was sometimes called, and what a wonderful sight after the long trip over the Edson Trail. There were 6 buildings along the main drag, known today as Richmond Avenue.
Pioneers moving to Grande Prairie stopped using the Edson Trail in 1916 when the Edmonton, Dunvegan, and British Columbia Railway arrived in the area. From then on, settlers came to Grande Prairie by train. In the 6-year history of the Edson Trail, thousands of settlers traveled over it to start a new life in the Peace Country. While some people found life in Grande Prairie and area too hard and ended up moving back to the bigger cities, many more stayed and built Grande Prairie into the busy and active city it is today.